Hi, everyone. We just want to say a big thank you and welcome to our third webinar in the webinar series that the CATS Foundation and NPUK UK has been holding. Throughout this year, we're holding regular webinars about various topics that are of interest to our patient communities to kind of help them really understand various topics. And this webinar, we're really excited to say, is going to be all about participating in a clinical trial from the patient perspective. We've got a great range of speakers who are going to give their own personal views and also the views from their experience in this area. And we'll touch on a few very different topics and have a panel afterwards, which will really dig into this topic in more detail. As usual, we will be recording this webinar and it will be up on our YouTube channels in a day or so. So if you have to drop off, no problem. We can send you a link to the webinar when it's live. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker. So Kim, if you're okay to join us. Great, if you come off mute, and then I'll let you introduce yourself and the topic, and so you can share your slides.
Unmute. Well, oh, great. Thank you so much. Can you see me, everybody? And Dan, I'm okay to share, correct?
You should be fine to share if you can.
Okay. Super dupes. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Kim, as Dan said. Let's see, wait a minute. Sharing is not turned on. Oh. Sorry, sorry, a little technical here. Yeah.
Should be okay now.
Let me see. Let's see. Okay, then fingers crossed this works. And if I go into,
perfect.
Can everybody see, I hope?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, my name is Kim, and I'm here to talk a little bit about rare disease patient enrollment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of an industry insider, because one of the things that I always do when I talk with patients is they go, oh, I had no idea that's what went on. So I'm going to try to mix this a little bit with letting you know what we as an industry should be doing and should be doing better in all ways, shapes, and forms. So one of the things that is kind of like a premise point is that, conventional patient recruitment that we use in drug development is really inadequate for rare disease trials. I would kind of argue it's inadequate for any kind of trial, but it sort of really is bad for the rare disease. We have a tendency of just saying rare disease is everything, and we lump it all into one bucket. And the truth is that we don't treat that way, and we certainly shouldn't recruit for patients that way. But industry doesn't necessarily have a very fine lens to see the distinctions and the different ways they could be recruiting. But what the result is quite tragic, because over half of rare disease randomized trials end up discontinued or unpublished. And the failure is often not due to the drugs, but rather to the whole system and the mechanisms that we use in order to conduct those trials. So I'm here to say this is not just a business problem. It's one that we in drug development need to sort out. But more importantly, it's a societal one, because there are life-saving medicines that are potentially not getting to the people who need them. And those of us who work in this space are very passionate about making that happen, even if we know that sometimes we have to get out of our own way in order to make that happen. So here's a little overview. It's a bit busy, so you don't have to worry about all the details on this slide, but it's really just to say that our drug development process is highly dysfunctional and very distressed in general, and rare diseases suffer enormously because of this. And it's high time we actually had a rebuild for what we do, because we're still doing the same things that we did in the 1990s, when the drugs that we developed were actually kind of more general. They weren't very complex. They were much easier to find patients and to treat patients with. But if you see that in the first over here, you can see that was mostly run by big pharma. Down here, you can start seeing it's mostly biotech, which means the funding mechanism has also changed for how we develop trials. And that has a huge impact in the demand for outcomes and return and getting things done very efficiently and very quickly, which we as an industry aren't always so good at doing. There's also a problem with the fact that back in the day, less than 5% of trials were outsourced, and now over 70% are outsourced. This was all the start of the contract research organization in industry, which we call CROs. And those were really founded back in the day to optimize sponsor responsibilities, not site or investigator responsibilities. So there's a bit of a gap in the focus. It's much more focused on doing the monitoring and the development rather than the thing which is now the big problem in our industry, which is patient enrollment. And these organizations aren't necessarily motivated to change because they benefit from it being quite a bloated system. And I know because I used to run one. So I used to sit there and think it was absolutely scandalous. The fact that, yeah, if it kind of runs over, we wouldn't say it, but certainly we would just write an extra 30% on the next, the back end of our financial forecasts. And it's not acceptable because ultimately it's patients that are suffering from this. So many things have changed. We put a lot of junior people now at the coalface of making decisions about important things like enrollment, whereas back in the day, there were much more experienced individuals. And as a result, enrollment has always been trouble, let me say, because we use doctors, volunteer doctors who are part-time research hobbyists to conduct studies. But now, because things are so complex, it's really getting bad. And over 90% of trials now miss their deadlines. It's just actually crazy. So the take-home message of this slide is that the landscape has changed, but our outsourcing model hasn't. And that's contributing to a lot of the problems in rare disease product development. So we formed Renable, we're kind of a rebel group here, to be the world's first trial delivery company. We are not ashamed, and we are not hesitant to say that we will deliver and stand by our ability to deliver. And the reason why we do that is because we put enrollment, patient enrollment, at the center of our operations. Yes, we have the full service CRO behind us, but it's not data management or clinical monitoring that's the center of our universe. It's enrollment. The others are kind of the peripheral groups. So we strip out a lot of the costs that traditionally go there, and we refocus them on the things that actually make patient enrollment happen. And a lot of that is actually down at the site level. We have a very strong track record, not as an individual company, but the people who run it have maintained an 80% delivery track record across every indication, every country, every modality for the last 20 years, as opposed to the industry average of 14. So we're quite bullish that our methodology does work, and hence why we've kind of come out saying we can do better. And part of the reason why we can do better is that we have a very, very in-depth process that's our proprietary methodology that we call trial science and delivery science. And it's pretty fancy, but actually all it means is that it's enrollment-led planning and proactive problem solving before the trial starts. And when the trial goes, we augment and manage and help sites to actually, with the logistics and the operations, by adding skill sets and techniques and knowledge that they won't individually have. So we make the whole work a lot better at the site level. And we do this because hope is not a strategy, but it is a strategy that we in pharma and biopharm have used for many years, which is maybe that protocol inclusion criteria may knock some patients out, but we'll just wait and see and let it happen. So we've developed an amendment culture, which we're trying to address and say, no, get it right out of the get-go and complete on time and spend your money more wisely. So that's just a little nutshell about what we're about, because what I'm going to show you comes out of our trial science methodology. And I also want to point out we think differently. And so one of the things is you'll see industry focuses a lot on the word recruitment. We don't. Recruitment is part of it. It's a very important part, but it's a tiny piece of it. And if you only concentrate on recruitment, you won't enroll patients. when you shine a light on what's actually involved in the universe that makes up enrollment, it's quite extensive. So we focus on all that. So going forward in this, you will hear me talk about enrollment, not recruitment, because I'm trying to show a much bigger picture on what we do. And in order to look at rare disease enrollment, there are three really key ingredients that I would say are important to that. There's many, but I've kind of isolated the ones that if you don't have these, you're really, really going to struggle. The first is identification. So how are patients identified in healthcare? That's a really important question because it drives a lot of the decision making on what we can do in the clinical trial process as well. The next one is location. So where are these patients seen? And how can we make it easier for them to be seen and to participate in our studies? So that could be looking at transportation support. It could be doing a hybrid model of decentralized trial. It could be getting, biopsy portable units out more into the community. There's a lot of things we can do, but we have to ask that question about it because it's not always one size fits all. And then probably the most important ingredient, and one that I would actually say, if I would have thought better about putting this together, I probably would have put it on top, which is trust. So what is a patient's relationship with the healthcare system currently, and how can we improve on it? Because if the relationship is a bit fatigued, if it is a little untrusting because of maybe cultural situations in different countries, and all medics aren't trusted, then maybe that's going to bleed into the clinical trial process. And we better think about that and include ways to overcome that if we hope to be able to engage patients with this disease. So I'm just going to focus on the identification for the next few minutes, just to show you how we do it and how we look at it a little bit differently. So remember, I told you we have a different lens, and this is what I call our enrollment lens. So I took that big bucket over there of all the rare diseases, and I said, let's look at it. And the thing that's going to be really important here is the disease awareness of the rare disorder and the patient's journey through the diagnostic process that are really going to define these. And I've kind of come up with 4 different categories, if you will, of those that each of these diseases over here will bucket into, and many more in the future. And I'm sure, this will be something that we constantly are updating because as the science gets better, then the way that we look at things and interface within healthcare is going to have to get more sophisticated. So our first one there is defined conditions. Hold on a second. I'm just going to move our face out of the way here so I can see. Yeah, defined conditions with known patients. So these are well-defined. These are the diseases that have well-defined clinical criteria and diagnostic pathways. So say cystic fibrosis would be one. And also the patients are tracked in specialist databases and registries, and the physicians usually have a list that they manage of that. So that's one type. The next 3 are actually where it gets pretty hard, and very different. I would put that first bucket almost in kind of a traditional identification of a disease that might not necessarily be rare, but will have a lot of the common characteristics around it. Whereas these other 3 are a whole different kettle of fish. The defined conditions with protracted diagnostic journeys, that's where you might see some extensive doctor shopping histories from our patients, and the diagnostic delay can be anywhere up to 5 years. They will go through a lot of different doctors before they find out and get their diagnosis. So they're gonna go through quite a bit, and often are quite fatigued by the time they arrive, and maybe we will be interfacing with them for a clinical study. The next category are the genetic subtypes that are undetectable with the current standard testing. That's a real different identification challenge, and that's where the mainstream genetic panels will lack the necessary resolution to identify what's going on at the molecular level. So chances are pretty good neither the physicians nor the patients know of their molecular diagnosis. And that presents a different problem. The ultra-rare diseases ultimately have a different profile altogether. That's where the patients are numbered less than 100 globally. There won't be established care networks or registries usually, and there's a high mortality rate with limited trial windows that we could even conduct in. So those need a different approach as well. So what I have done here is I've said, okay, I want to show you guys what we then let's concentrate a little bit on one of these. So I picked the defined categories or conditions with protracted diagnostic journeys. Now, the theme for this one is actually very simple. It's not easy to execute, but it's very simple. The biggest barrier to enrollment is getting diagnosed. Okay, now that may be a little bit different. So say you've got a second line treatment, new product that you're bringing out. So you're really only interested in the patients who are already diagnosed. But what you're going to have to do is look upstream because your patient population coming through is equally as important if it's a first line treatment or second line treatment as well. So it's going to affect your trial, mostly because of the numbers, but it will affect your trial regardless of where your drug is aimed to intercept the disease process. So that's going to be the biggest one. The causes are general lack of awareness and knowledge. And the truth is, if we can't make a difference in medicine, if we can't affect a disease, it tends not to be looked at as much. That's why we do it at first up front in the science. So it's kind of a chicken and an egg cycle. So that's definitely going to be causing it. You've also usually got a situation where the presentation is quite complex and it might involve different systems, different organs, and also a lot of the symptoms will be pretty common and shared with others, things like diarrhea, irritable bowel. And so the tendency is therefore for the diagnostic process to take a little bit longer. Now, in clinical trials, we could choose to be passive and do nothing, and a lot of people do. And then we wonder why it takes us so many years to recruit and enroll in our studies, because we're just following that natural that trajectory that we see in healthcare. But if we were proactive, maybe what we could do is improve symptom interception and diagnosis. If we did that, that would change the game altogether, both for the patients that go in the clinical trial, but also patients in general. So that will be, could be not that complicated, or it could be complicated depending on how rare the disease is, because you'll need more of an approach, more of a diffuse approach if it's very rare. But the key thing here to realize is, and I've got my little guy pondering down there, this is what we have to do at market launch. Okay, so when a drug comes on the market, you got marketing teams and they're all there going, okay, well, we need to get to people to prescription. So we do that anyway at that stage. So why don't we do it when we launch a new investigational product onto the research market? So our philosophy is that you have to take care of the landscape and the healthcare in which you are launching an investigational drug. And that usually means for stuff that's rare, that you're going to have to impact how it is intercepted and it is diagnosed. So I wanted to show you an example of it. This is a patient journey. So the first thing that we do is we go, how is this done? And we do it country specific. I just picked Argentina because I just did. And I said amyloidosis just because I did. No special reason here, other than it's a good disease for with a lot of frustrated patients waiting a lot of time to get diagnosed. So in this one, what you can see here is at the top, and don't squint because It'll drive you crazy trying to read all the detail. It's not the detail that's important. It's just the fact that it's there. And it basically captures, in green there, you've got from symptom presentation all the way through specialist referral, follow-up, and supportive care. And then down the side, I've got the key healthcare practitioners that they will interact, what the process is as they go through that individual step, and then what are the regional variations in that country. And they can be quite significant. And Argentina actually is a really good example of where that can be so important. But our goal by doing this is to improve symptom interception and diagnosis at the end of the day. So I'm going to put my trial lens on, okay, and show you what happens to the map. Okay, it's kind of heat mapped in a very clunky way, but it's just to show you the different things that the journey can tell us as clinical researchers as well. So the first in blue is disease and trial awareness. So these are the areas where we really need to think about doing that and strengthening that awareness. But you can see it goes through all the way through, even in the follow-up is important to kind of keep that whole diagnostic process aware of what is going on and this opportunity for this trial in this disease. Then there are opportunities to, identify potential patients. Something's come up here. Let's flag and tag their medical record and kind of watch and see and make sure that they would be ruled in or ruled out. There's also the funnel, which is my yellow. The funnel refers to the number of patients that you need to consider for a clinical study in order to come out the other end as enrolled. And that's really important from us from a cost containment, management, drug allocation standpoint. So I've just highlighted some areas that would be really useful around that funnel management. Then there's the pink, which is kind of interesting with this particular disease because you've got so many different practitioners seeing the patient at different times. There's a lot of opportunity for things to fall through the cracks. So I call it a co-pilot landing, for lack of a better term, which is where we can actually help to consolidate that information and maintain that in such a way that it makes it easier for the clinicians to make diagnoses. Then there is the candidate alert, which that would change depending on what product and where you're trying to apply that in the disease life cycle. And then most importantly is patient experience. Now, there's a lot of negativity in this. If you got up really close and looked at, you'd just say, oh, these poor patients. So my point in flagging it is these are the areas that we should be targeting in our clinical study to make that much smoother and that much better, for these people. So it's a way to kind of get going, and I'll do this maybe 30, 40, 50 times with just one country just to get it refined and get it really understood to help us in our trial science process. And so what then happens, and this is just a tiny snapshot of it, but we take what is the disease-specific knowns and the trends around it, combine it with what we see with a given country, and then that starts directing our enrollment strategy themes. And remember when I was mentioning to you that we, look at streamlining CRO, outsourcing budgets so that we can take a lot of that excess away from the budget that may be given to, I don't know, contract negotiation, because that's not done very streamlined. And this is where we would be funneling that funding and recommending to our customers that they invest. And so here there's one that we use. I've got a whole database of 25 years of different tools, tactics, and techniques across all kinds of things. And a lot of this actually, interestingly, didn't come from necessarily always rare disease, but I look across disease because I look at healthcare. So I was thinking, this reminds me a lot of the work that we did in some of the early HIV work. When we were trying to identify CD4 count as being a biomarker. So before we had that biomarker. So that's what I mean by thinking kind of laterally through the patient identification process and thinking of it through a healthcare lens. So what I call research market priming is really important here. If lack of awareness is the issue, then we need a rare aware campaign to make clinicians understand it. And that can be done through all kinds of interesting mechanisms. It can be local, it can be national. And then also some in-depth things about, let's talk about some symptoms and start thinking potentially of what that composite could mean sooner than maybe they would. And then also, obviously, to engage patient advocacy groups, which I think in the rare disease space, we probably, as an industry, do it the best, which still there's a lot of room for improvement, but great sources for support and help in designing our studies and also helping us to spread the word about our studies. But ultimately, what we should be all about is speeding up that diagnosis. And so we should be considering how can we, strengthen early screening capability? How can we get a means to fast track to specialist referral in this country? How can we subsidize access to things like mass spec and genetic testing that we may need? We may consider putting a coordinator on the ground as well. I never rule that out. I always think about what can we do to make the sites stronger, better, have more skills than they could possibly have in their current patient care management. There's ideas like telemedicine hubs, so we could connect those very rural GPs with hospitals like in Argentina, that would be Hospital Italiana in Buenos Aires, for real-time case reviews, mobile biopsy units, get those up north and bring some of those regional diagnosis delays down. So all in all, you're making an impact that's really helping healthcare through clinical trials. I think that's my main message, is that if we're smart, we can actually leverage what we do in trials to improve healthcare. So my wrap up would be, more often than not, challenges around diagnosis and management in healthcare is where we're going to find problems in enrollment. It's not rocket science. It's usually right there in front of our faces if we ask the right questions. And to overcome that, we must intercept and improve what's going on in healthcare around that. Whatever strategy we employ needs to have at least those three dimensions of identification, location, and trust that we put a lot of emphasis in. And we need to recognize that we're the ones that have to do this. It's not going to be sites. Sites won't have the resources and the skills that are needed to make these really robust and make them happen properly. And the other thing I would say, or the last thing I think I would say, is really a call to arms to everybody in drug development to see the right enrollment strategy as an investment. Because by improving detection and diagnosis, it will impact our studies first, but ultimately it's going to help with the prescriptions, downstream. So it's a win-win no matter how you slice it. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope I didn't go on too long. Thank you.
That's great, Kim. Thank you for that. It's super interesting. And those are real points relevant to rare disease space. And I'm excited to see from the conversations we're going to have with other speakers shortly as we dig into that in a bit more detail. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'll see you in a bit.
I'm going to ask Bob now to come off camera. Cool. I'll hand over to you, Toni, to introduce Bob.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased that Bob could join us this afternoon. Bob is the Group CEO of the MPS Society and Rare Disease Research Partners. And MPS diseases like Tay-Sachs, Sandhoff and Niemann-Pick diseases are part of the lysosomal storage disorder family of rare disorders. And these come, as we all know, with a range of challenging symptoms, and they are often life-limiting. Bob's sons, Oliver and Sam, both have MPS II, which is known as Hunter syndrome. And Bob has been very open about his family's journey with MPS and how he's devoted his life to helping other people with these disorders. And so we're really grateful to him for sharing his experiences with us today. So over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much, Toni, and hello to everybody. Listening to Kim's presentation, you can see how complicated the clinical trial is. But it doesn't need to be. It really is as simple as, in the rare and ultra rare space, every patient is unique. And so on a clinical trial, every patient needs to be treated as unique. And that's one of the things on a rare journey, a rare life, is that the only certainty in our lives is uncertainty. And this couldn't have come at a better time, because actually my youngest son is looking at taking part in a clinical trial. And so he's been asking me all the sorts of questions, and I've been having to check whether or not I understand the clinical trial and so on and so forth. So I think there are a lot of big words used, and we have uh, um, things such as long consent processes, consent forms, so on and so forth. So why initially would you want to participate in a clinical trial? Well, really, it's turning hope into action, because there's a chance that on a clinical trial that the patient's condition could improve or stabilize, or even the disease progression slowed down. And that's very important for us as the patient community, that stabilization or even slowing the disease progression down is a real win. And in some clinical trial designs, they don't take that enough into consideration. So it's understanding why participate in that clinical trial, and that is that you will, A, get a gold standard of service when on a clinical trial. So when you and I may go to hospital and we see our pediatricians, or we see the adult doctors, we are in part of the system that is the everyday. A clinical trial is not every day. So you tend to get the best levels of service on a clinical trial. You'll have the best tests. You'll often have things like you may well be in a single room when you're having a treatment, so on and so forth. And so you do get a really, hopefully, good experience. And staying on a clinical trial is really important too, because rare disease patients and families, it's not just about the patient, because this affects everybody. 1 in 17 people have a rare disease, but more than 1 in 17 are affected by a rare disease, because it takes in consideration the family. So when being on that trial and making those commitments, it's not just the patient, it is the family that is committing to sometimes quite a long trial. You may be going into hospital for up to 6 to 12 months, for instance, and that may be on a once a week basis. And indeed, the trial that my son is looking is on a once a week basis. So there's a big commitment. So we need to find ways of making that journey better. And it's something that at the NPS Society we have been doing since 2005. And that is, on every clinical trial, the patient organisation should be contracted in as part of the delivery of that clinical trial. Now, we've been doing this, as I say, at the NPS Society since 2005, and we move patients from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world to be on a rare trial. And we do it as not for profit. All of the proceeds are ploughed directly back into patient services. And we know our patients on that clinical trial on a one-to-one basis. And we have the statistics that proves that using the patient organisation approach increases retention on clinical trials, because the patients can relate and trust the patient organisation to do the best for them. And that's a really, really important thing. And it's something that we're increasingly working with other patient organisations to help deliver, because patients need confidence that they are going to get the best service possible. And if you're anything like me, when you see a consent form to go on a clinical trial, because you've suddenly got that piece of hope that may make a difference to the outcome for your loved one, you just tend to sign it on the bottom. Not many people actually read the whole consent process. So another thing we try to do is on clinical trials is to find a way of sitting down with the patient and their family before the clinical trial consent process and have an initial run through that consent form so that we get chance to answer some of the questions that may come forward and to make sure that the families really understand what is being undertaken. Because if you drop off a clinical trial, yes, it obviously affects you as a family, but it also affects the statistics and the clinical trial data that will eventually be submitted. And that could affect the outcome of whether a clinical trial is successful or not. In effect, has it met its endpoints? So really understanding that there is a commitment for you as a individual, but actually you're also committing as part of the community to help the community. And one thing I've known on 23, 24 years of this journey, rare patients are trailblazers. They are the bravest of the brave, and they take risks for others. And I have never seen that in other environments. And we're quite a unique bunch. And, you know, I'd like to think there's no barriers between any of us. So it's quite easy actually to understand what you may need on a clinical trial because we can talk about it openly. One of the latest things that's coming in more, which is so important, is psychological support for the family whilst being on a clinical trial. Some trials you may have to move countries. And I think the longest family that we have relocated has been 5 years. So you have to look at schooling, you have to look at visas, you have to look at everything. And understanding that and working with the family on that close basis to ensure that that trial is as easy as it can be is so important. And that's why the patient organisation being involved, and not just as a cursory organisation to be consulted, but really being intimately involved in that clinical trial, not just the design, but the delivery. And whether that, you know, whether that's Tay-Sachs, whether that's NPUK, MPS, patients will get a better experience with that patient organisation involvement. And that reduces stress levels. So therefore, we're also already going to see that the psychological effect of being on a clinical trial, the negative effects will be reduced because we'll know the patient knows us, and that is such an intimate relationship. And that gives them confidence to ask us maybe some more intimate questions that they're having or that have come up when either consenting on a clinical trial or actually whilst they're on the clinical trial. We've at the NPS Society, I've had to deal with marriage breakdowns and various other issues in the middle of a clinical trial, but we found a way through to make it work for the patients. And I think in rare and ultra rare, you understand the journey. I know Toni and I know Dan very well, and they understand this journey. And having that understanding to help a patient go through go through a clinical trial, which is, there's no getting away from it, is a commitment and can be hard in places. Having that person that understands it, that you can pick up the phone to, is an unbelievable asset. And we need to make the trial experience better for our patients. And we as patient organisations will know many of the patients anyway. We will have a big network globally where we can identify patients and we can point them in the right direction of clinical trials. And for our pharma partners, and I call them partners deliberately because this takes all of us to work together, it's just worth bearing in mind that each day an average clinical trial extends beyond its finish date, costs the pharmaceutical company or sponsor roughly $500,000. So it is in everybody's interest to make sure that a clinical trial finishes on time with the best possible results and the best possible experience for patients. It's something I worry about as a chief executive. It's something I worry about as a dad. And going through the last week, 2 weeks with my son, and actually being recruited onto a clinical trial creates a lot of uncertainty in the mind of the individual. So you will have maybe some real behavioral issues in terms of it's scary and how are you going to deal with that? And I want answers. Well, you're not going to get all the answers because do you know what? It's a clinical trial. It's there to find out some of the answers. So you're not going to go into a clinical trial having certainties, okay? But what we can make certain is that the experience of being on the trial is the best that it can be. And that is what needs to be explained to the patients. And I think some of the other things, some of the minor things is we don't need to necessarily know all of the complications that go on a clinical trial, but we need consistency of people to speak to. We need to be able to have a safe space. And, if the unthinkable happens and that a clinical trial doesn't work, we need to be assured that we are going to be able to integrate back into our previous lives with the minimum of hassle. And that means that companies should also design a clinical trial with failure in mind. Because do you know what? Many, many, many clinical trials do fail. And we have to make sure that those that have been brave enough to go on a clinical trial should be given the resources to go back to their previous lives in whatever circumstances that may be, with maybe some additional psychological support, because all of a sudden you've lost the hope of that particular medicine that's in development working. So there's a big psychological adjustment there. And now for the first time, we're seeing treatments that are going to make a difference to those that have been neurologically affected. So you may well have heard about the blood-brain barrier before, and we're now seeing treatments that are coming through that are crossing the blood-brain barrier, which means there's a whole new cohort of patients who are now looking at a possibility of treatment. Now that is fabulous news, but with that does come some uncertainty. So I think all in all, we have great opportunities. I think there needs to be closer conversations that involve patient organisations, and because they are the trusted ones in this environment. And I think we owe it to all of our patients who have been brave on a clinical trial to do our best for them. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. That your words really resonated with me, and I know will with many in our communities, in particular around the uncertainties and the fact that patient organisations are often the ones picking up the pieces when things go wrong, and the fact that we are the ones obviously that have to explain that clinical trials are experiments and not necessarily treatments. So thank you so much for sharing that experience. And I think at this point, we're going to bring in all of the panel members for a bit of a discussion. So if you'd all like to turn on your cameras and unmute. And I'll first of all start by introducing our final panel member, and that is Gisela Linthorst. Gisela is Head of Patient Advocacy and Engagement for Asafaros, and she brings a wealth of experience in national and international advocacy. So thanks for joining us again, Gisela. We're really grateful.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a question back to Bob, actually. When you think about clinical trials and participating in clinical trials, how often do you think patients and families really truly feel like partners in that research rather than subjects? And perhaps Kim and Gisela will give their thoughts on that as well when Bob has.
If I'm being really honest, I think that is in the minority. I think that patients are very scared. They don't hear what's being said to them. Their families are very confused, and I think that it is a very poorly understood journey, because let's face it, in most of our lives, we would never come across being on a clinical trial. All of a sudden, we're thrown into a world we don't understand. And I think that that is where there's got to be a lot of work, because we do feel like, in many ways, we are just adding to statistics for the benefit of profit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really good, Bob. What you said, several things, like really. I've been jotting stuff down, but we like to I think about patients as contributors to the journey. And that mindset does change, but certainly, Toni, to your point, and Giselle, I don't know how you feel, but I would certainly say, particularly because of the outsourcing model that we go through, we allocate a lot of the management of the clinical trial to these contract research groups, and that distances the sponsor from the patients and from the doctors. That, to me, is the big problem that needs to be solved, because the passion and the commitment is very rarely in that outsourced group. It's in the people that literally are sweating and have put their lives into developing a product, and they should be together. So we try to facilitate that, and that's why I said thinking about contribution. You can't have a clinical trial. You can't have a new medicine without patients. You can't. They are the most important aspect of it. The science is important, hands down, but the patients are the most important, and they're the ones that we're trying to help. So, yeah, so I would certainly say I want to see more, better.
Yeah. Yeah, I fully agree. And sorry, I took another location because they are working. I was not sure if there was a lot of noise. I agree, Kim, because I think it's not only at the moment of the study that the patient should be involved, right? It's a burden enough to be in a study, and we are, as a company, we must, and we are very grateful of patients who want to be part of the study. So I think we have the obligation and responsibility to include them already upfront by means of a patient organization or by patient speakers, talking with patients in focus groups, just to learn what is going on and what are the struggles they have every day, and where we can accommodate not only the product but also the study. So finding or developing a study with the involvement of patients and patient organizations, I think that's crucial. You said in rare disease it's much better. Yes, I agree. I think in rare diseases it may be better than in the bigger diseases, so to speak, but we're not there yet.
No, it really speaks to how low the bar is, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
exactly. And I think people and companies are really trying. Keep in mind that a lot of these studies are done by small biotechs, by small startups. So it's not always evident that there is somebody who is really focused on integration with patients and involvement with patients and patient organizations. But I think there is it's sort of a steep stairwise evolution going on, that it's really seen as important. And I think to talk already with patients upfront on what a study should look like, or what a study participation should look like, does something with your recruitment, or as you said, with your, you had the other word for it, but also with your retention. And I think it is so beneficial to do that upfront. So I fully agree.
Yeah. Very good. Can I ask a question, Toni, of Bob? Because I thought, again, so much of what you said, Bob, really resonated. You mentioned about keeping a clinical trial simple, which I love. What in your mind is that simplicity? How can we, as designers of these trials, and knowing that we've got certain scientific questions we have to answer, But what in your mind is like the ideal scenario?
So in rare and ultra rare diseases, you shouldn't do a randomized controlled blind trial anyway, unethical in most places. So you start from that basis.
Okay.
And it is about looking at everything and simplifying everything that you can. The language that's used in the consent form. Oh my, do you know what amazes me? And I even look at it, my own diseases, my own disease, mucopolysaccharidosis.
Yeah.
Really? It means nothing to most people. And you will find that in the consent form that you'll have heterogeneity or whatever it is. And you just think, well, how many people are really going to understand that?
Yeah.
So it's about the campaign for plain language. It's about, and I'm really, really, as you would expect, passionate about this. Having, we're involved in clinical trials in 20 to 30 countries,
Yeah.
and providing that patient experience. Nobody can provide that support in NPUK like NPUK. So
Yeah.
at the very least, there should be somebody contracted in from NPUK to be advising through that clinical trial. Same with Tay-Sachs and Dan's organisation at CATS. You've paid for that. One day that you run over a trial, you've lost 500,000.
Yeah.
So one day pays for all of us for the
Yeah.
whole trial. So you need to see a bit further. And the other problem, if you look at since the introductions of CROs, the patient experience, I believe, has been diminished.
Yes.
CROs add a lot to the price and halve the experience in many cases.
Yeah.
And you are seeing a move from companies away from CROs again. And they are brilliant at big scale trials. We're talking about rare and ultra rare, N of one.
Yeah.
Everybody is an individual. And the only people that can do that are the patient organizations. And so contracting with them in a ethical way, which is easy, is a win for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It really speaks to the point I was trying to make with one of my first slides, which is it's different now. Everything's different. We're able to tackle diseases now that we couldn't even dream of tackling back in the 90s when CROs were developed and everything else. And yet we're following the same process. We're thinking the same way. And it's just like we need to wake up. And so that's really exciting. And have companies been quite receptive to contract with you? I know I can think of several. If you're not working for, I might give a call.
So yeah, we've got in fact, I'm constantly recruiting. So we work in not just in lysosomal diseases, but we're working in mitochondrial disease,
Yeah.
in a rare cancer. We're working with some of the biggest organizations because I have my own medical writers and researchers. And so we do the patient-focused research, the ad boards, so on and so forth. And I believe that it is, and it's the only model I know of in the world, but I believe that working alongside, and again, this is the reason we set it up was to give a better experience to patients. And both Toni and I and Dan, we work in the LSD collaborative. And I believe it's a model that would fold into the LSD collaborative to make it truly sustainable because we're all experts in our own fields and we can bring that expertise to the clinical trial from compound, really. As soon as the compound's been identified, that's when you engage the patient experts and you go all the way through beyond approval because we must aim for reimbursement, not approval. And that's
Exactly.
another thing they get wrong. And again, keeping that close relationship with a consortium of patient organisations such as the LSD Collaborative is something I think that is going to be the model of the future.
Mm.
Can I also add something, Bob, because you said placebo-controlled studies are unethical, which I fully, for the rare disease and even for even for the ultra rare disease, is something, and it's not a good thing. The problem also is the request from regulators. So it's not always the company who chooses this, just to put it in perspective. It's give and take, and it's also during discussions so yes, the patient involvement is important, but we are also working with other stakeholders, let's say, like regulators, physicians, etc. So everything in the mix makes finally the design of the study, right? So just
So
as a
we have a way forward on that. And it's, again, simplifies it as far as I'm concerned, is you do a biomarker, if there is a biomarker, and you follow it up with a managed access agreement over 5 years. It absolutely resolves all of that. And we've seen the FDA moving towards biomarkers. They have now put, I think it's 4 or 5 treatments down the accelerated approval access pathway. We had a meeting in Amsterdam a couple of weeks ago where the MHRA have now moved quite a way, I think, to accepting biomarkers. And we have a bit more work to do with the EMA, but it's the way forward. And that way we can address the uncertainty, get rid of the randomized control trials with placebo, and actually gather the data that means something to patients, as well as regulators. I actually asked somebody who's the head of another patient organisation and a patient, so you've been on treatment, how do you think it worked? And they said, oh, it's worked fine. She said, but do you know, none of the trials that we've been involved in had what the patients wanted as endpoints. Not one of them.
Mm. Yeah. Very telling, isn't it? Very telling. But I think just your point about the regulators is hugely important. And I am of the belief, Bob, that you and others could really help from this side of because we need some of the laws to change, and we need people to see, I mean, nobody wants to say to the FDA or to EMEA, stop protecting us. But it's like, what are you protecting us in a model that might have worked for, brand new asthma medications, salmeterol, salbutamol that came out in the early 90s. This is a completely different kettle of fish. And so and I know there are some initiatives, but I got to think a lot could be, I think the regulators need to hear patients' voices more.
I agree. And I think on this call, for instance, I look at my 2 colleagues on here, 2 world leading patient advocates who are the best of the best. And, without me wanting to embarrass them, they're never going to be quiet.
Yeah.
And they are going to fight with their last breath for patients, and have been for many years.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, many patient organizations still believe in the ideal world of passive cooperation. I'm afraid in this world, as we've seen, passive cooperation gets you ignored.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Right.
I will stress, I think there's a difference between the regulators hearing from us and listening to us. So what I've seen is they're very happy to have the conversation, but they don't take on board the real life experience. I wouldn't say advice, but the real life experience that's given to them. And that's one of my biggest frustrations when we've done lots of these sorts of meetings where we've presented the true impact of the disease. We moved away from an N of 1 story. So we explored it as how varied the actual disease is, and still they don't listen. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we're asking companies to innovate, to try new approaches and how they design their trials, how they recruit patients, the endpoints they're going to use, but then the regulator is still 10 years behind where they should be. And I think that's what I know that Toni and I have done together with the company before, is try to accelerate that with the regulator, to get them to see that things are different, even from like 10 years ago when people were designing trials in 2015. They're very different now. And actually the endpoints that they are wanting to see from a patient community who is well informed now, which again is very different, because people are empowered to take control of their health. They're empowered to do their own research. They're told, you will be the expert of this disease when they're diagnosed with it. And then when they are, they're then ignored at the most crucial point, when they're going to have access to a treatment. So that's where I think there has to be a big shift.
But couldn't it be, I mean, it's almost like a public awareness campaign because the pressure, you guys kind of would be sort of the front line with it. But, we need to make the public aware that there is good science out there that, in many instances could be cure. And we can't get those out because of an antiquated process. And I think maybe that's me being crazy, but I think it would be highly motivational, and start impacting, things like elections and stuff. It just needs to come out of the, I think people need to know, um, that this is holding us back.
So if you think about the campaign, 1 in 17,
Yeah,
that's 1 in 17 voters.
yeah, exactly.
And if you make that the patient and their families, it's probably more like, I don't know, 1 in 8, 1 in 6. And I think, again, and I talk about the LSD collaborative because I think it's a fabulous model. You need to have a certain nucleus to break through the traditional glass ceilings of our individual diseases and their reach. So doing it with like-minded organizations that create a larger voice for those that don't have a voice is, I think, the way to go. Strong and powerful advocates advocating for their individual communities, but for the same thing across the board.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And one comment also is that the empowerment of patient groups, I think in the UK, you have very, very strong patient groups. There are a lot of countries who don't have that yet, but with your collaborative, you sort of spread also your quality and capacities towards the other countries, which is very important. And then you can have this conversation, in general conversation, to companies and payers, etc. So I think it's also the responsibility or the opportunity for patients and patient groups to be at the table and to really speak out. And if you see a study, speak up and say, okay, this wouldn't work for us. I think companies need to work with patient organizations, but patient organizations have also the opportunity and the responsibility to do it in the right manner, right? And I think we are lucky with all of you, but it's not in every space and it's not in every country.
Yeah.
I think that the input of patient organisations is not always as valued as it is in this space in particular. And, that's a question I would throw back at the panel as to what is the role of patient organisations, not just in the initial trial design and making sure that you've got those very clear endpoints that are important to the community, but in reducing the burden on patients and families when it comes to recruitment and the clinical trial process. And, so, I mean, Kim, how do you see patient organisations fitting into the work that you do?
Oh, hugely. I mean, some of in the buckets that I showed up where we have those organizations, great. It's more the ones that don't, because they're so rare, or like the genetic subtypes that it just doesn't even exist. And I've worked with, pharma companies and biotech that they're pulling their hair out because it's like, how do we reach? We don't have a patient group. And it just, by using those moments where you go, wow, that shows how powerful it is. I mean, to me, I think it's, but again, it's that old 90s model where you kind of see patients as an afterthought. And that's what's got to change. And I think a lot of that change is happening in rare disease, and rare disease could become the model that can be adopted outside of it for correctly understanding how to engage. And I think that's certainly I'm incredibly inspired by just hearing Bob, and hearing you talk about how, to simplify an informed consent takes a long time. It is much easier for us with our complicated language just to spit it out and get it into the ethics committee for approval. But to craft that and do that, is a lot of work. But I could almost see a scenario where you kind of crowdsource the development of a informed consent. You bring a bunch of patients online and say, okay, here's this. Does this make sense? How about this? And almost collectively writing it as a group. But that is we need the pioneers to show the rest of industry that you don't have to do it the way that it was done when we had the big blockbusters, like, the hormone replacements and the, Solmetarols and all of those Prozacs and stuff, which were broad and kind of hit everybody. We're into precision now. So we need to tear up that playbook.
And I love, Kim, the fact that you're trying to.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff that you were talking about, I was just thinking, yeah, absolutely. And to hear that is so refreshing and giving us hope and cause for optimism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, definitely. I mean, I've been doing it for 25 years, but the traction is just now happening. And I think the model is now so broken that we're now at the point. I mean, I have, because we have a whole investment arm to Renable. And we're looking at it where nobody will, it's really hard to raise money right now for cell therapy. And it was the darling. And the reason why is because it's so costly and it's been pushed to the end, the very end of the line. And it's all because of the manufacturing requirements. If we could change the manufacturing requirements, it could be available at every hospital. And it would be a game changer. So now you've got a situation where, I know people who've got really, really important, really strong data, drugs that are coming out, and they can't get funding because it's now fallen into that bucket. And that's the kind of stuff that we really need, to stop. Whereas I'll go, you know what, we could do this a little bit differently, and maybe microdose your investment to get a little bit further and focus on biomarkers, say, for example. But pharma is in particular for the 90s, if you would do an exploratory study, that was okay then. It's not okay now. So I've actually, in about 5 years ago, I repackaged an exploratory study as a biomarker study. I relabeled it, same bloody thing. But you know what? Sometimes that's what we have to do in order to get people to move where we need them to be. So, yeah.
If we bring it back to the patient perspective, Bob, and think about right at the very beginning, what would we want researchers and companies to know before they start to ask patients to participate in a clinical trial? What would we want them to consider?
I think considering what do patients and families want out of a life that could be improved by a treatment? To be quite frank, doing one of my bugbears in clinical trials and same with many is the 6-minute walk test has no relevance whatsoever to a family's life. Dan actually taught, and this is one of the other great things about patient organizations talking with one another. Dan told me about the sit down, stand up model and what have you. So I think it's relating, what's the problem you're trying to solve? The problem you're trying to solve is a rare life lived better. Okay, it's not a reduction in GAGs. A reduction in GAGs, glycosaminoglycans, in our diseases, is a measurement that may indicate that a disease may be being improved by a treatment, but that means nothing to patients. Them staying out of a wheelchair for an additional year, 2 years, or holding on to simple words because they've still retained the ability to communicate verbally. Now that's what really matters to patients. That's really hard to measure sometimes, and I get that, but that's why we need to be innovative on the measurements and how we go about doing that, because it has to matter to patients' quality of life, not just length of life.
Yeah.
I think that's very well explained, Bob. And, another point that I would ask from a patient perspective is about the risks and benefits of being involved in a clinical trial. Many patients think that they're joining a trial and then that treatment, it's just going to work and it's going to be fine. Do you think there is more we could do? And, you've talked about the consent process and how complicated it is. And, how do we make it much more simple for people to understand what the potential risks, and I know that a lot of us in this community have an attitude to risk that is far above that of the general population, but if we could explain it a bit better so that people are going into a clinical trial really with their eyes open about what could happen, and you mentioned the outcome being a potential failure, how do we get people to understand that but not remove the hope of a trial?
Let me give you one example there that also gives me a real bugbear on gene therapies. So pharma came up with a wonderful word for gene therapies called conditioning. Conditioning is chemotherapy. In many cases, they use the same treatment, maybe in a smaller dosage, but you've tried to soften it, but taken away the reality. And actually, you need to treat patients and their families as equals, as people that do understand a bit. And do you know what? Patients will always accept honesty. Honesty is key to a good relationship and a good clinical trial. So make it simple and tell them the downsides, because do you know what? If they don't know and they get to find out, it'll be 10 times worse.
Yeah.
And you have to risk that they drop out. So that they have to know what they can expect, right?
Absolutely.
I think
Well, that's the whole point of informed consent, right? You need to make sure that they have the sufficient information to make their judgment and their decisions.
Yeah, and not
But
only to go in the study, but also to stay in the study. And I think that is also something I learned from you all. That's even more important, right? To stay in the study. And it's difficult when a study is longer than a year. It's difficult.
But that's the role of advocacy, to ensure that families know what they're signing up to. Because
Yeah.
I've seen too many times families sign up to a study and be like, "What? I have to go into the site every 3 months. Well, they want me to relocate, but you've already signed all the forms." So obviously there's a disconnect in how the information is prepared and provided to them. But I think advocacy also needs to step up and make sure that people are fully aware of what a clinical trial is. A trial is not a treatment that's going to potentially save your life. It is a trial. It's trialing a drug to see if it actually has any benefit to you or your loved one. Second, it's a huge responsibility to an entire community, because you're taking part in something that can shape the direction of companies doing research and developing treatments for that disease. And again, I think it's really important advocacy steps up and has those honest conversations with families so they know that they're signing up to something that's potentially benefiting them, their family, but also the wider community.
That's a really good point, Dan. And there are things that when you're designing trials, you could consider in terms of monitoring, the home monitoring, perhaps, that there's many instances that is happening now that means it's less burdensome for families to take part and they don't have to take time off work or school to participate in trials, which can be a real impact on their lives. And also, considering how many hospital visits and what types of testing are involved, because that does, as you say, you get 3 months into a trial and you think, oh goodness, I can't keep up with this. So it's how do we think about that and make sure people are aware, but also that those tests and hospital visits are absolutely necessary, making sure that they're planned for a reason, and it isn't, just that people have to take 2 whole days out of every month or whatever it is to keep on participating.
I totally agree with you, Tony, that we're in this world of discovery of trials that may be part hospital based, part home based, and we're still figuring that out. So with all of the AI stuff coming, I think we need to be optimistic that it will reduce the burden, but not too optimistic that you will replace the clinical visits, or you will still need some of those, because AI does not offer the answer to everything, but it can certainly reduce the burden, and also the willingness of secondary centres to do some of the more simple tests, or even, some of them will have employ nurses to come out and take the bloods and so on and so forth. But we still have a problem when you're doing that in many cases, a simple thing like even taking the bloods does not work in the home care environment at the moment.
Yeah, and I also think when it comes to coming back, Kim, to your area of recruitment, there has to be ways of making clinical trials more accessible to more people. Bob talked about the support that they provide for people traveling from country to country to access these trials. And it would be great to think about what we could do to support people so that they're more accessible geographically, financially, and culturally as well.
Yeah, and I think all of that, the problem is we don't think about that up front traditionally. It's an idea that's kind of passed down, and that's why I said a lot of it has to do with our outsourcing model, which most biotech companies, there certainly is, Bob, as you said, a pushback where sponsors want to be close to their sites again, but a lot of them are trapped. This is now this cycle where this is what we have. So the outsourcing basically prioritizes the wrong things, or other things, what I would call downstream. Like, I can worry about monitoring after I have patients in. Worry about patients in should be the first thing I'm worrying about. So how am I going to get them? So if we can shift and we can insist, this is where it will change, and sponsors can help change it by insisting that we don't, CROs give you a bid. That's a sales document. It's not a plan. So we're allocating and we're rewarding, not planning. We're giving them contracts, hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds worth of contracts on a sales document. And so the answer is to say, no, before I award you that, I want to see how this is going to work. It would really challenge the industry to start bringing that forward. And that's where I can see the patient groups, Bob, like you've been talking about, really coming into play. Because I would kind of look at it and say, you're going to have a lot of that expertise, and then we get the right sort of skills really around you to kind of take what you say in your instructions and run. And then it's easy to manage, because then we can just monitor it. Either it's done well or it hasn't done well, because right now nothing's doing well. So, it's a good risk to take.
An extra month up front saves you 3 months minimum on the back end. So you're already net plus $1 million.
Yeah.
If you have it's to me, it's sensible to do more of the work up front with the people that know about the life journey, so that it runs smoother. If you start off with unknowns, those unknowns get bigger.
Well, what I tend to find is that, again, we're so linear. So we go, okay, well, there's clinical. We're still preclinical, so we're not going to think about that yet, right? And then by the time we're ready to think about it, we're so pressed for time to get launched. So I always say to companies, look, we're an extra pair of hands. You can contract us. You don't have to have the big contract. Start working, and we'll actually help them raise money, and we'll differentiate you while you're raising money, because you're going to have a bloomin' good patient engagement strategy with validated data, no more assumptions. And therefore, your budget variation is only going to be 10%. It's not going to be this wild 30 to 40%. It's just crazy. I think it's really about us rebels kind of squeezing ourselves into that process, making us, you need to do this because downstream it will help. And I do believe now's the time. I'm certainly seeing it with our investment raise. And it's quite interesting. I keep talking to people that are sponsors who are upset. They're talking to sites and finding out that you know, they're getting CRAs given to them, the clinical research associates that don't know anything about the disease. And it's just wrong. And then there's people like you. Bob, you could probably be a better CRA.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
You know, and it's it's a good time for a revolution.
But I also think one other consideration, PIs can oversell the clinical trials sometimes.
They sure can.
And I think we do need to have a dose of reality there, so that you know, if these patients are going to take a risk, and some of them, as we know in gene therapies, know they've not going to receive the optimal dose, and it's a one time only, yet they've still been prepared to be on that clinical trial. They deserve honesty, and I think there is some work to be done with the sites.
You are
Occasionally.
so right. So right. I've got a training program on for doctors because years ago it occurred to me, these guys patients just show up. They don't have to sell. So they don't know how to sell, first of all. So the ones that sell are either really good at it and it's wrong. We have to help doctors. We got to give them the playbook. How do you do this in such a way that encourages in an open fashion consideration without misrepresenting? We shouldn't just assume anyone, including research nurses, can do the same thing. I agree with you entirely.
I think that's particularly important when you have multiple clinical trials running as well. And, you know, you have to help patients to make an informed decision. And of course, patient advocates can do that to a point, but patients really need to consult with their clinicians to decide what's the best option for them. And if you haven't got a clinician that is familiar with all of the options that are available, or with the disease itself, in some cases in other countries, perhaps not the UK, but that becomes a problem. So I think we need to think about that as well.
It's a really good point, Toni, that, you know, in the UK, we have, for our diseases, we have 8 or more clinical centres of excellence, and then satellites. Some countries, I mean, you can even go to the States, who's a really developed country. Sometimes they don't know how many clinical centres are actually got any experts in these diseases. And you'd think that they would, but they don't. And then you go to other areas of the world, and many of our patients are going to come from, or future patients are going to come from, emerging areas. And so I see a role for patient organisations that are mature and working together to actually be outreach and help those countries grow their patient organisation infrastructure. That's one of the things we can do if industry helps us to do it. And that way, we then start to get rid of some of the health inequalities that are profound around the world.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, Bob. And you know, it's almost like the patient advocacy groups can fill that gap, you know, that exists. You know, when we're looking at what's going on when a clinical trial, I always say a enrollment is the application of research onto a healthcare platform. So it's not natural. It needs some help integrating into it, definitely. And a patient advocacy group could be a really, really nice way to make that happen. And you know, much to my point about improving the diagnosis, improving the identification of symptoms as being critical, there's no reason why that couldn't be part of and led patient advocacy led initiatives around that could be lasting long after the clinical trial's gone.
Gisela, how do you feel about that from a company perspective? Do you think that would be useful?
Sorry, I hope you don't hear all the noise outside. So yeah, I think it would be, can you rephrase the question? Sorry. For the noise, sorry, Toni.
So the involvement of patient organisations in leading the way when it comes to the recruitment side, when making sure that the clinicians are aware of what's happening in the field and being able to inform and act as a
Excuse me. Yeah, yeah, I fully agree. I think there are some sites who never, who don't have the experience, or maybe have the experience from one study, but also not always have the experience from a lot of patients. So I think if the patient organization can help what a patient would need or what the community would need, I definitely think that really helps. And I also think that we talked about it internally as well, that CROs need to be open to involve groups and use their expertise, right? So yes, I completely understand and I completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got just a very few minutes left. And so in the last few minutes, I wonder if I could ask for just one sentence from each of our panel members, and perhaps I'll come to Bob first, as a message to our patient audience in regard to participating in clinical trials. What would be your final thought to pass on to our communities? And Bob, we'll go to you first.
So to pass on to our communities, rare patients and families are special because we're prepared to lay the groundwork for others.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Kim.
Yeah, what would I say? I would probably say thank you, first of all, probably foremost, for even considering it. And, you know, do what Bob is saying, because we need that support to help us, those of us in the know, on the other side, try to make the changes that are needed, that we know are needed. And the more that you all as patients collaborate and make some good, strong noise, the easier that's going to help us make our changes.
Fabulous, thank you. Gisela.
Yeah, first of all, I think if a patient considers or participates in the study, know that it's really appreciated. It's needed, but it's also really appreciated. We understand the struggle to make the decision. And I also think speak out, speak up if there's something you don't like, in a sense, how things are organized during your whole study. Make it clear to the hospital where you are, and they can communicate it to the CRO and to the company, and to see if we can change it or we can accommodate it even better. I also think what I said before, be active if you still have the time and the energy for it. Be active in your patient organization and share your experience and share what it is, also to help other patients in the future to take the decision to be part in a study. So I think yeah, it's from both ways. We appreciate, but I also think we need you to help move things further in the future for all kinds of diseases and studies to learn from. Yeah.
Thank you, Gisela. That's absolutely perfect. And I would echo all of that and say that my own message would be to stay in touch with your patient organisation. And in that way, you will be fully informed of what's happening and have the opportunity to ask the questions that you need to take back to your clinician and your clinical team. And on that, I'll hand over to Dan for the final words.
No, thank you, everyone. That was a really, really interesting webinar. Just from my perspective, a closing statement would be that for anyone to take part in the study is exciting. You know, you're one of the lucky people who have the opportunity to do that, and you have the opportunity not only to change the future for you, but also your entire community. That's something that I think is absolutely fantastic, and to all the companies out there doing their work to make that possible. We obviously say thank you, but we're here to be collaborative and to help you be successful and to plan for success. So on that note, a big thank you to all of our speakers. This webinar has been recorded. We'll upload it to the YouTube channels, and we will share it on all our social channels, and we'll email it out to people. But if you have any questions that come out from watching the recording or that come to you later, please just reach out to myself or Toni, and we'll do our best to either answer the question or put you in touch with someone who can support you. So on that, thank you very much to everyone, and we will see you for the next webinar in a week's time. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye. Bye. Thank you, Kim. Bye. Thank you, Bob.